Hello and welcome to World at Work TV. I'm Tanya Adamski. Today we're speaking to Steve Marley of ZS Associates. We'll be talking about employee satisfaction surveys designed to ensure that your sales incentives are effective. Steve, can you tell me a little bit about how your survey is designed differently from your typical employee satisfaction survey?
I think a typical employee satisfaction survey tends to be deployed by an HR department, and it tends to be a more general survey. So you're looking for things like employee engagement, loyalty to the company, job satisfaction. Those firms might be done or might be deployed by a third-party vendor. So it creates some independence, but ultimately they're applied to the entire company. So regardless of any type of segmentation or job categorization, it's the same survey to everyone. When we think about the survey that we deployed or the surveys that we deploy, we tend to look at them as being a little bit more specialized. So think of an IT survey that goes out. With an IT survey, you might get questions around your computer usage or your smartphone, your internet service provider, the uptime within your organization. In that way, you're getting specific information about one particular job function within the organization. The sales compensation surveys that we create are very similar. They're intended to measure the effectiveness of your sales compensation program as determined by the employees that participate in those programs, the salespeople themselves. So our surveys actually have two elements to them. I like to call it element one is the perceptual element, and element two is the motivational element. The perceptual element is how do people perceive their compensation plans? Are they happy with the plans? We tend to ask questions here that are open or close-ended questions. They're things like yes or no answers or 5-point rating scales, something that have discrete answers, but they're intended to assess whether people truly understand their compensation program, whether there are any perceived biases, whether they're happy with the results. The second element is the motivational element, and that's really what do the employees, what do the salespeople value? I think a lot of organizations, sales leaders in fact, tend to look at it and say, compensation, cash is king. That's what motivates my salespeople, that's what gets them out of bed in the morning. This survey is designed to understand whether there's other elements, other drivers of motivation that are at play. So we look at things that a salesperson might say, I value non-monetary rewards, or I value recognition, I value time off. If we can design an incentive program rather than a sales compensation plan that builds some of those elements into it, then you can have a more motivated, more effective sales organization.
How do generational differences come into play?
You know, it's interesting because we have a partner at ZS, his name is Mike Ahern. Mike gave the keynote presentation at the Spotlight on Sales Comp last year, and he just completed some research on generational differences in sales compensation. It's really interesting stuff that he basically looked at millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers and said, do we see differences in the way they look at sales compensation? And the results were actually a little bit surprising. You look back on it in retrospect and you can say, oh, that makes intuitive sense. But the millennials value things like team-based incentives. They prefer some equity in the earnings opportunities. So for example, if you have a contest, the millennials were saying we would rather have 3 winners with equal prize distribution versus one winner at $1,500, another one at $1,000, another one at $500. Somewhat surprisingly to me is the millennials actually preferred commission-based plans. That compare and contrast that with the baby boomers. The baby boomers, they value quota-based plans. They like individual accountability, and they actually want a little less of the pay at risk. So it's probably tied back to cycle of life, and I'm not sure that it's generational in nature. It might just be stage of life, maturity, whatever it happens to be. But if you can identify differences in those groups and design an incentive program that appeals to people that are in that particular category, I think again you're going to get maximum motivation and best results.
How do you use the data that's collected to design more effective programs?
We tend to collect, as I mentioned, 2 types of data. There's the perceptual data and then there's the motivational data. The perceptual data are things like biases. So if we ask a salesperson, do you see some bias in your incentive plan and what is it? And they say, I would rather work in territory XYZ because their earning opportunity is higher. What that does is it gives us a potential hypothesis to test. That a lot of times there is objective data that's available and you can mine through that data. Asking the reps through the course of the survey gives you an indication of where you could look. It's where to start digging when you're mining the data. It also gives you a sense for whether there is something you need to fix in the compensation plan, and that might be just a plan element itself. That if you ask a salesperson, what product do you promote the most, and they say product A, and you look at the incentive plan, and the incentive plan actually has the most incentive weight on product B, there's a disconnect there. So why are they promoting a product that has a lower incentive weight? Is there something inherent in the sale of product B that makes it more difficult, and therefore they are downplaying the importance? That type of disconnect is important to understand. It could also be a communication challenge. If you ask the salespeople what product you spend the most time on and they pick the one that has a lower incentive weight, it might be because they don't understand the plan. The plan is too complex, there's too many components. There might be an opportunity there to simplify. So looking at the survey results on the perceptual side allows us to make either potential corrections to the plan itself or changes to the communication and how we roll out the plan. Now when it comes to the motivational element, you can use those results a little bit differently. That is where you might say, we've got a plan that's built and highly leveraged. The salespeople are at a point where they are definitely looking at money as the key motivator. The motivational element might say, wait a second, they're actually telling us that they have other preferences. When we look at those other preferences, now we might structure something that's closer to a total rewards program. At ZS internally, we're calling it total motivation. So motivation drives behavior, behavior drives results. We want to make sure all of those are in alignment. The motivational element allows us to look for disconnects between what we want the reps to be doing, what motivates the salespeople, and where they're ultimately coming together.
Were there any ahas from the findings?
I think there's a number of surprising results when we do the surveys. I touched on some earlier that when it comes to different generations, that millennials, for example, favor commission plans over quota-based plans. That baby boomers, for example, like the individual accountability that comes from a plan, whereas millennials prefer to work in team-based incentive environments. What we can do with that now is structure compensation plans and maybe offer options. Now, it's very difficult in a survey to ask somebody a protected question. You can't ask questions around race or sex or gender, age, those types of things. But if you can segment your respondents by broad categories, geographic location, age ranges, for example, tie those age ranges back to generations, and now you start to see some differences across those different categories or segments. Now you can build some incentive plans around those. I think it's also interesting to find some of the results that when we've done surveys in the past, we tend to think that cash is king. We've actually done some surveys where the respondents show us that depending on the sales role, there's a number of salespeople that actually value the relationships they have with their customers almost as much as they value the money that they make off those transactions. So rather than adding more money to an incentive program to try and get those people to be more motivated, perhaps we can increase the amount or type of customer interaction. We've also found that a number of salespeople value learning opportunities. So how do you provide them a career path and a path forward? A lot of companies tend to think our best reps, their career path goes into the manager level. And what we found is that's often not a successful path. The competencies that you need to be a successful manager are often different from the competencies to be a successful rep. But if you can provide a learning opportunity for a salesperson that gives them a path to grow, that doesn't necessarily result in them ultimately reaching a plateau or becoming a manager, again, now you can have a more successful program.
What's the best way to introduce this survey to the employees, and to what extent do you share the results with the actual sales force?
We tend to offer multiple ways for an organization to reach out to their sales force. The primary mechanism we use is by leveraging the first line managers. The problem with a survey is you want a survey that maximizes the number of respondents. That we tend to collect information when we're doing a project in two ways. One is through a survey, and the other is through interpersonal interviews. It could be a focus group, it could be a one-on-one interview. With a one-on-one interview, you get a slice of data. You get information that is fairly deep in the response, but fairly narrow in its breadth. So you're getting maybe 10 people, maybe 20 people. That might represent 5% of the sales force. What we don't want there is the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Somebody complains about something and there's a base rate fallacy that we then apply that to the broader sales organization. That's where the survey is important. And the survey, on the other hand, isn't intended to be something that takes an hour for somebody to complete. It should be quick, it should be easy for them to complete, but it should capture a large proportion of the population. So quite the opposite, we're looking now at very broad, fairly shallow, and the two of those can balance each other. Now, the way you get a very broad respondent group is to make sure that they understand that a survey is coming forward. If it comes from a third party and they don't know what it is, it might go to their spam folder. They might see it and delete it. They might open it and not understand if it's really something that their company is doing and then delete it as well. So what we like to do is leverage the managers. The managers send out a communication. The managers let the reps know that the survey is coming out. Once the manager makes that communication, as soon as an email is received that has sales compensation survey in the title, most reps want to respond to it. We typically see 80 plus, in many cases 90 plus response rate when it comes to a survey. That's a fantastic response rate. We would typically expect something in the 20 to 40% for another survey that is unaided. The managers drive a lot of that. Now, when it comes to communicating the results of the survey, that is highly dependent on the organization. What I've rarely seen is organizations share back the raw data. They typically don't want to do that. There is some level of aggregation that goes back, and it typically passes again through the first line managers. They're the ones that the reps trust. They're the ones that they interact with on a daily basis. They're the ones that share the results back. Now, those responses are often provided from the headquarter organization in terms of this is what we're doing with the results. We heard X, Y, and Z. We're going to do A, B, and C. It shouldn't just be a dump of information. The reps won't necessarily look at that and understand, well, what change does that mean for me? We want to give them clear direction. We want them to understand what are they going to get out of completing the survey. And that's the most important part that comes through that manager channel.
Well, thanks, Steve. That's some great information on surveying your sales force and using the results to drive more sales.
Thank you.
For World at Work TV, I'm Tanya Adamski.